Hi. So at this end of the shop, I have the CNC machine, and sandwiched between the machine and the dust collector, I have the computer to run the CNC machine. And when I put all this together, I moved my cart over here just to put the monitor on, and it was always supposed to be temporary, and it's become sort of permanent. And it'd be nice to be able to use my cart in the rest of the shop instead of it just being a dumb monitor stand. The other issue is that it would be nice to make something that isn't so wide, so I have a little more room for me in this space. Right now it's a little tight in here. So my plan is to make a piece of cabinetry to hold the monitor and the keyboard and the mouse and give me a little more space back here. When I started this design, I had something much more complicated in mind. It was going to go up and down. It was going to be sort of an outer cabinet and an inner cabinet, and there'd be gears and a track, and it would move up and down, and it would give me a desk that would go between a sitting desk and a standing desk. But I ended up deciding that was all much too complicated, and I could make something much simpler that would really just be a standing desk. I really don't need the sitting desk out here. As I'm usually doing something at the CNC, and then I walk over and I do something on the computer, and I don't need to sit down for that. And I find I walk over and I waste a bunch of time sitting down and standing up and sitting down and standing up. It'd be nice to just have something I could walk up to and just use. So that's more the idea. So the thought was to just do a simple cabinet that would be two side pieces and a desk for the monitor and sort of a platform for the computer to sit on. And then some smaller ideas was to put some French cleats on the outside so I could make little things that would hold, like the panic button, and my little controller could go on that. So there's like 4 or 5 things I need all the time, and it'd be nice if there was sort of a place for them. Just a quick break here to point out the link in the description of this video for the Makers Mob's lowest price drop ever. As this is the post-Thanksgiving Black Friday Cyber Monday weekend, for a limited time, the Makers Mob presents the Authentic Craftsman series. In this limited run series, teachers like myself, Jimmy DeResta, John Peters, John Heitz, the Samurai Carpenter, Liam Hoffman, and Neil Pass will teach you skills necessary to become an authentic craftsman. The Authentic Craftsman series will teach you everything from traditional hand-cut joinery, wood turning, furniture making, blacksmithing, and even leatherwork. So don't forget to click the link in the description below and take advantage of our lowest price drop ever before it ends this Monday at midnight. I've been thinking about this project for several years now, and I think in the past I've always envisioned it being made out of birch plywood, but that's gotten really expensive, and I have all of this pine in the middle of the shop that I really want to get used up and out of the way. I'm starting with these pieces that are all pretty much the same. They're about 3/4 of an inch by 7 inches by roughly 5 feet. Most of the pieces I need for this project are bigger than those dimensions. The first part of this project is getting these smaller pieces jointed and planed, and then glued together into larger pieces that I can actually use for the project. I cleaned up the surfaces. I cut them roughly to the length that I was going to need. I think the width was going to be about 30 inches, so I was cutting them to 31 inches. Then I could joint one face, and I basically did this process for every piece of wood on the project, and then planed the other side. And it wasn't really that this was difficult, I just had to do it over and over and over again. Then cleaned up the edges. I would joint one edge and then cut the other edge on the table saw. The 2 sort of shelf pieces in the cabinet, one to hold the monitor and one to hold the computer, I made out of these smaller pieces. And I would start by gluing up the first piece with biscuits and get that joint nice and flat. Then I could glue the second layer onto that layer and make the piece thicker. I wanted the shelves to be a little bit beefier than the 3/4 of an inch, even less once I'd planed these pieces. It was more like 0.65 inches. So I did this for the 2 shelves, the keyboard tray, and the 2 sides that make up the cabinet. And you can never have too many clamps. So I've been gluing up smaller pieces of wood to make bigger pieces of wood. That's basically what I've been doing. And I've been kind of clamping them the same way, where I clamp the width together, and then I put some kind of force to hold the 2 or 3 layers together. And it seems to be working fairly well. And then once I get these bigger pieces made, I can then start cutting them down to their final sizes, and I can, the 2 big sides of the cabinet, I'm going to put on the CNC and do some mortises, not mortises, dados, I guess, into those to take up the piece that holds the computer, and then the sort of desk piece that holds the computer monitor. I had glued up the 2 side pieces in a similar manner, and on the outside of the 2 vertical side pieces, I wanted to have a French cleat so I can hang little objects off of that. I wanted to do the cleat in a slightly different way. Instead of cutting a strip with a 45-degree angle in it, I would cut a much wider piece and make what would normally be the strip be a negative, or be space, so that the thing that you're hanging from the vertical surface fits into that slot instead of hanging off of a strip. I suppose it's like a regular French cleat system with strips, but the strips are really wide. Think of it that way. The third layer in this build-up to make the vertical sides are these pieces that make up the slots for the French cleat. Instead of clamping these, I just use pin nails to hold them in place while the glue dries. I'm going to be cutting these with the CNC on the other side. My nails shouldn't be long enough to hit the bit on the CNC. And this is sort of an overall view. You can see I'm using a good bit of the shop to do this. Taking stuff from the joiner to the planer to the table saw to the radial arm saw, and then gluing things up on my work table. I wanted to make a back for the cabinet, as I wanted some kind of protection from the sawdust and the sort of the chips that get thrown off the CNC machine. It's sort of a wall to stop all of that. So I glued up a bunch of pieces to make sort of a big surface. I think I filled my glue bottle 2, maybe even 3 times on this project. And I put those together with biscuits. I would glue up a few, clamp those, then glue up the next one, and then clamp that, and then glue up the next one and clamp that. So it's sort of always under pressure, but I can do a whole bunch of joints at once. I cleaned up the inside of the vertical sides. I'm going to cut these on the CNC now. So I wanted to put a rabbet on the ends so that I can hold it better with my hold down clamps on the CNC table. So I can make some quick cuts on the radial arm saw. So this first rabbet on the CNC is to take up the space of the back. The back panel will have something to fit into. And this piece is going to be for the shelf for the monitor, and I can make sure that's going to fit. I will clean up the end on this piece at some point. This is the space for the shelf for the computer. I'm going to have sort of a rail system for this to attach to the CNC structure. So I'm cutting that slot right on the side of the side panel. So I did that twice, one for each side. And I did remember to mirror the cuts from one side to the other so they would face each other. wanted to make sure all of these are the same length. So I put a stop in place. That'll let me cut the shelves to the same length, so the cabinet will be square. So once I've glued these pieces up into bigger sections, I can just treat them like a bigger piece of wood now and just cut them down to what I need. And I can make sure it's going to fit. I can cut the shelves to width. I think I was sanding at this point, so I had on my respirator system. I really wanted this structure to be adjustable, so I didn't really want to glue the bigger pieces together. So I ended up using screws between the sides and the shelves and the sides and the back. So I drilled a hole through the dado. Then I flipped the piece over and drilled countersinks into the outside of the vertical panels. Then I can put the pieces together with screws. And I cleaned up a few spots where the radius of the CNC bit doesn't cut a perfectly square corner. So to make sure the parts are going to fit together, I have to clean up that radius. So remember the back that I glued up? If I have the grain running vertically down the side panels, I don't really want this big expanse of grain running in the other direction screwed into that side panels. So I decided what I would do is cut up my panel back into the strips, then attach each strip with a set of screws. And this will give a much shorter distance of side grain to expand and contract. So hopefully it won't split. And I cut each of those pieces to their final width. I thought about cutting them before I cut them apart, but then I wouldn't be as sure that they would be square. So I did it this way, which took a little longer. So originally, I was going to have the keyboard sit on a little flap that would sort of hinge out from the desk that the monitor sits on. But I remembered I have a box of slides, and I thought I had a set of really short ones. And I went and looked, and they were 10 inches, and they were almost perfect to make a keyboard tray that would slide out from under the monitor. I wasn't quite going to have enough width in the side panels, so I had to cut a small relief hole in the back panel to allow the slides to go a little bit further than the back of the side panels. I needed just a little bit more width for the slides. When I cut those relief pockets on the CNC, I remembered I wanted a hole in the shelf for the monitor for the cables to run through. So luckily I've put everything together with screws so I could take that shelf out, and I made a hole for the cables to run from the monitor down to the computer. So it's sort of mundane CNC work, but it gets the job done. And I can put the shelf back in. I hadn't quite gotten the screw out all the way. When I took this out, it made it hard to get out. I can start to lay out the pieces for the back. I decided I should put in the drawer slides at this point. And I thought I would just mark where they would go and put them in place. But then it seemed like it made more sense to actually make a stop, or sort of a very simple jig for the slide to sit on, so they would both be the same distance from the shelf that the monitor's going on. So right now the cabinet is upside down, and this made it easy to just put the slides in. And then my relief pockets were in the right place. And I can mark where I want to add screws. You can see now that I'm only clamping the wood across the grain between where the screws are going in. So it's only about 2 inches. instead of having a large back panel all glued together. And then I've got cross grain across 3 feet or close to a meter, which would probably split at some point with the wood movement over the seasons. The very top piece was just a little bit long, which is good. It's better than being just a little bit short. So I could use the joiner to just take off that little bit of extra width. This is me working on the back pieces. This was mostly between the table saw and the work table. Now it's time to work on the keyboard tray. So I had that piece glued up, and I can just cut it down to size. It just needs to be the right width and the right length. I put it on top of the monitor shelf, and I can mark where that hole for the cables is. And I need to cut a notch in the back of the keyboard tray. As the tray is going to slide in and out like a drawer, it can't be a hole. It needs to be a notch so the cables can sort of stay in place and the drawer can move. I didn't cut this piece all the way through, as I didn't want that piece flying off when it finished. So I could cut the rest of it with the bandsaw and clean up the cut with the spindle sander. Then I can attach the other half of the drawer slides to the side of the keyboard tray. It's a little tight, but it works just fine. And with that extra bit of length, it's nice. It actually sticks out a little further than it normally would. My idea is to attach this to the frame of the CNC machine. What I came up with was to make a set of rails that are the same width as the side panels on the cabinet. So I glued up 3 pieces that I planed at the same time that I planed the pieces for the side panels. So this will then make something that same thickness. And I can just glue those together. And once those are ready, I can joint and trim up the width. In the back of the cabinet, I have 2 slots at each side, roughly at the center of the side panels. And what I want to do with these rails is to make the piece that fits into that slot. And I'll mount these rails to the CNC frame. Then I can attach the cabinet to these rails. And that will allow me to mount the cabinet quickly, and it will also give me some adjustability in the height of the cabinet, because I'm not entirely sure what height I should set it at. I've kind of guessed at something. I'm sure I won't really know until it's in place. To go with these rails, I'm making some stops that will sit at the bottom of the rails, and they'll hold up the weight of the cabinet. So I want to make a stop with a dado down the center of it. And that dado will sit in the rail that I've made on the previous piece. You'll see how that works right here. And I can cut that piece into 2 stops. I was a little bit nervous about how I was going to mount the rails to the CNC frame. I was going to need to drill a somewhat complicated hole where there's a short section that's the width of the bolt that will be holding this to the frame, then a longer section to take up the diameter of the head on the bolt. That section has to be a precise depth, as the bolt needs to stick out a very precise amount. And it would be somewhat nice if the bottom of that hole was flat for the head on the bolt, although not critical. The part I was nervous about was getting the 2 bolts, one at the top and one at the bottom, to actually go through the piece of wood and find the connection point in the 80-20 aluminum. Because I couldn't see where the bolt had to be. I just kind of had to feel for it and hope it went into place. Also, the dimension between the 2 holes had to be very precise. because there's no play in the frame of the CNC machine. And there's really no adjustability. I had to get it right on the first try. And it took some fiddling, but it did actually work. So I felt really good about that. And once the bolts are in place, I can move those rails around on the 80/20. So I can get the width of the cabinet exactly right on those rails. And once they're in place, I can tighten them up. And if they need to be moved, I can untighten them and move them pretty easily. Drilled some holes in my stop blocks. And I can attach those to the lower section of the rails. Once I did one, I could make the other one level to that first one. I made the rails vertical as well. I can finally bring the cabinet over. You can see how this is going to fit together now. So hopefully I can get the rail and the slot to fit. So those stops take most of the weight. When I first put it up, I sort of stood there and looked at it, and it felt a little bit high. So I lowered the stops about 3 inches, and that felt a little better. Temporarily, I can use a clamp to hold the cabinet in place. I can put the keyboard tray in. That seems to work. Feels about right. So the idea is to have most of the weight on the stops that I put in below, and I'll use a clamp to hold the cabinet to the rail. The clamp isn't taking very much weight. It's just holding the cabinet from falling forward. And I can put finish on. I just use shellac as it dries really quickly. Now it's time to put the computer back. I thought it'd be a good idea to clean it out as it gets a little dusty. I realized that I needed to get power into the space for the computer, and I needed a hole on the bottom shelf. I should have cut this earlier. I can just drill a hole now. This took a lot longer than I'm showing in the video. And I mounted the power strip to the back. It's one of these where it sort of has hidden screws. You put 2 screws in, not quite all the way, and then it hangs on those. And I can bring the computer over. I'm going to need to get some cable mounting hardware. Right now everything's just kind of shoved into place. And one of a few problems, I mounted the power strip too high, so the keyboard tray wouldn't close. So I lowered the 2 screws I had put in for the power strip, and then it worked. I can put the monitor in place, and hopefully I've made it wide enough. And the cables fit through the hole that I had cut. I was worried that they wouldn't fit. I'd measured them, but that's just how it goes sometimes. And the keyboard. One place I'm really going to need to mount the cables down is for the keyboard and the mouse. So they fall in that slot that I cut out in the back of the keyboard tray. And the computer works. I didn't break anything. It's definitely different. I'm not used to having something so high right here, but I think I can get used to it. I can adjust this up and down pretty easily if I feel like it needs to be a different height. I mean, it sort of seems odd that I have to kind of peek around to be able to see the machine and what's going on, but I won't be sitting, so that'll be a lot easier. And it's really nice having the screen up at this height and just being able to come over here and just do stuff instead of having to kind of sit down and settle in just to push a button. And so I think I'll get used to it. I still want to make some little things to hang on the French cleats. Like it'd be nice to have a spot for the stop button. So it's right where I know where it is and it's always in the same spot and I don't have to hunt for it when I have to stop the machine. And also the touch plate, it'd be nice to have that always in a place where I can find it easily. And then there's sort of 3 or 4 tools that I use all the time, like the wrenches for the spindle and the calipers for measuring things. It'd be nice to have spots for all that stuff. I have those things in the drawers, but they're sort of far away. It'd be nice to have them out where I can see them, and they're always in the same place and I can find them. So that should be nice. So I think this will be good. It is very different. And it'll be nice having my cart back for other uses in the shop. Thanks for watching.